Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This is Tevora's webinar about board level cybersecurity, and it's really focused on issues this year that your board may ask you about. So thank you again. This is a topic that is in all of our minds, so we're not surprised to see the high number of participants. So thank you to each and every one of you in your busy days for joining us today. So the focus of today, why are we looking at this? So according to a poll from Statista, cybercrime actually cost organizations over $9 trillion, trillion with a T globally, just in 2024, which is why it is top of mind for so many individuals. So if we're thinking back to the last year, not only were there security compliance framework updates, which give tasks for all the individuals on this call to think about and manage, there were also a lot of headlines about cyber attacks, huge cyber attacks, being in the focus of across industries, across organizations. And all of that means that your day-to-day business might shift, your focuses might shift. And because of that importance in those headlines, the executives or your board may also be asking you either more or new questions about what you're doing within cybersecurity. So as we pivot looking into 2024 and what everyone plans to do and needs to do here, we're going to tap into some of our Tevora experts to talk about some of those key issues and insight on what you can expect to hear from your board. Before we jump in, I'll have everyone introduce themselves, including me. I do just want to invite anyone and everyone to enter any questions you think of into the Q&A box. You should see that in your Zoom panel there. You can enter any questions there. We'll do our best to keep track of them and answer them, and we will have a Q&A session at the end for any questions that continue to pop up. So for quick introductions, first, my name is Ashley Pfeiffer. I'm a managing director at Tevora of our compliance practice and our information security support practice, providing just compliance and consulting across information security. And before I hand it over to the three panelists you'll hear from today, each of these three individuals are part of Tevora's virtual CISO program, acting as fractional CISOs to organizations. And so they all have that experience, and they're gonna give their insight into what you can expect to hear from your board. Christina, I'll hand it to you first to introduce yourself.
Excellent, thank you, Ashley. Hey everybody, my name is Christina Iodice. So I've been in the industry for a little over 25 years, been with Tevora for 12 years, really been working with the board of directors for about 20 years and executive team. So happy to share perspectives with you all today. I'm gonna turn it over to Jeremiah.
Thank you, Christina. Hello everyone, my name is Jeremiah Solberg. I'm one of the principals here at Tevora. I oversee our federal, our healthcare, our strategic services that include our enterprise risk, third-party risk, vCISO privacy services. I've been with Tevora for just over 6.5 years, but have been in the industry since the mid-90s. I was able to cut my teeth with the DoD, so a long history with the evolution with the federal government. Held the role as a CISO before, and as you heard, I play one of our virtual CISOs, playing the fractional CISO role for a couple of our customers. Pass it over to Anir.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name is Anir Desai. I'm the manager here at Tevora for our strategic services. Strategic services for Tevora includes enterprise risk management, privacy management, and third-party risk management. I've been with Tevora for about 5 years now. I think it's exactly 5 years. I started my career out in the PCI world, the PCI field, and our PCI team, and then transitioned over to strategic services.
Thanks, everyone. So now that everyone is introduced, we're going to have Jeremiah set the stage. So Jeremiah, tell us a little bit about how and when you get pulled into these type of discussions.
Sure, absolutely. So the topic here is to talk about how we communicate, what kind of questions are we getting from the board. And I thought I'd take a minute to kind of talk about the board function, specifically when we're dealing with public companies. So it's an SEC requirement that public companies have a board of directors, and one of the teams that the board of directors is required to set up, besides compensation committees and other things, is an audit committee. And so you'll typically see, so my experiences today I'm going to share about are from my experiences, where I've been asked to join board meetings, join audit committee meetings. So I can only speak to the things that I've seen. I'm sure others will have different experiences. So when we look at the different boards, the size of boards, the board of directors typically has somewhere between 8 to 12, maybe up to 15 different folks on them. One of the boards that I recently presented to was made up of all ex-CEOs or current CEOs for other companies in that industry. And the board's responsibility is really to help provide assurances for the stakeholders, the shareholders in this case, that they are guiding the company, setting the right strategy. So one of the things that you want to always be aware of is what's the composition of that board? What is their background? So one of the things that when I go into these board meetings is to make sure that I do my initial research to understanding their prior roles, the prior organizations they worked with, other boards that they sit on, to make sure that we got some good insights there. When I'm dealing with an audit committee, I've been brought into a couple of those where I meet every quarter. Those tend to be a group of 4 or 5 folks that are ultimately responsible for the financial risk of the organization, but there's an ever-changing philosophy where the audit committee is also taking on the cybersecurity risk and role for the board. So typically it's a number of outside folks that have some independence, but sitting on an audit committee requires them all to have some background and be financially literate and managing books and the details for an organization, not managing the books, but overseeing those books. So the types of questions that I typically get are going to be raised from, what are they hearing in the news? They hear about these big articles, things that come up, and they're reacting to certain things. I know that, when ransomware comes up, that draws out another, set of questions from those audit committees. The other committees that sometimes we get brought into is steering committees, internal meetings for reporting. But as a CISO, I'd say the 3 different types of boards. There's internal boards, the audit committee, which is typically a subset of the overall board of directors. And, when you have private companies, sometimes they have different groups that you want to report to. So from my perspective, those are the different types of boards that are out there and the kind of questions that we'll share throughout our conversation today.
Thanks, Trevor. Christina, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, the one thing I would add, into that is, there's a lot of discussions around risk, at the various board levels and everything. And traditionally, executives, when they report risk up into the various boards, they talk about it from almost, a fear-mongering perspective. And the trend going forward is, and the communication from the boards is, please stop, change the dialogue. Please talk about risk and security from a storyline aspect. Let us know what's truly going on in the organization and the health, not just, what are you doing to complement yourself and kind of scare tactics. And so moving into more of a storyline directive, they want to hit up things that, one Jeremiah, mentioned was ransomware. How are we tackling the emerging threats that they're hearing about in the news, in articles, in industry hot topics, et cetera? Talk to them about that and how the security programs and the risks that you're identifying and mitigating help complement or mitigate those trends that they're seeing from a cyber risk perspective as a whole. And so developing those storylines is a critical component in order to engage and get your boards at various levels to understand what's going on and help ask informed questions in order to lead into how can they assist the organization and direct the organization with critical decisions.
Thanks, Christina. And so, Anir, over to you. Building on this, talk to us about what you're hearing about the new SEC reporting requirements and that role between the board and the CISO.
Yeah, absolutely. So the SEC requires organizations to provide standardized, timely, and enhanced disclosures, right, regarding risk management, strategy, governance, and incidents. But to do so, security leaders are going to have to help their boards perform effective oversight. So this really brings that relationship between the board and the CISO and becoming very essential in an effective cybersecurity program. Things such as maintaining regular and increased communication channels. One of the studies that I was reviewing, reported by Harvard Business Review, showed that only 47% of members that serve on boards interact with their CISOs regularly, right? And almost a third only see their CISOs at board presentations. And then the other factor being the execution of strategy, as Christina mentioned, right? Execution of strategy via risk reporting, metrics reporting, CISOs are going to have to double down on presenting cyber risk in a context of business risk, and making sure that that information is up to date and accurate as possible.
Got it. Okay. And then if I play the role of a lot of our participants regarding those SEC rules and navigating those requirements, how would I ensure that my board is meeting the governance specific requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I'd say the governance aspect can be a little tough to navigate, especially with all the forms and documentations that need to be completed on an annual basis. The governance disclosure needs to describe the management's role in assessing and managing risks and threats and incidents. Right. This allows the board to follow a committee structure similar to what Jeremiah mentioned earlier, relying on cross-functional collaboration between audit committees, risk committees, et cetera, to really maintain its effective oversight. And then again, I would say tying back to communication, right? Reporting on actionable metrics, having that involvement and visibility will be key.
Got it. And then if you pivot that into the time, so when this needs to happen, it's a lot of process changes, organizations have to account for a lot of things to navigate. So what are some of the key timelines for everyone here to be aware of?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to account for, right? Cybersecurity disclosures begin December 15th, something that would be annual for public companies. Smaller organizations defined as less than 100 million in revenue have some more leeway, right? With an additional 180 days, which puts them around the June 15th, 2024 timeline. Preparation of these disclosures and filling out the forms will require some reassessment and modification to some degree. Boards should be working with the management teams when it comes to evaluating reporting on existing risk management processes and how those disclosures are going to come into play. Not revealing too much, but just enough to make sure that we're addressing the requirements at hand.
I want to jump in here, Ashley, with one of the things that came up. I was actually meeting with a board in December, on-site, the full board of directors, and they were not aware of the SEC requirements. I thought it was absolutely shocking that I was like, yeah, are you all aware of this? And so I think part of our responsibility as CISOs, they should be aware of this. I don't know who's feeding them. So it's probably not right that's coming from us, but we're part of that conversation. We have to keep them informed. As part of their role, they're keeping us informed about things that are going on in the industries that we might not be aware of as their business experts. But I don't know if anyone else has seen that, but I think it's a bi-directional responsibility to keep each other informed.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, shifting that into compliance, Christina, what and kind of how are you seeing in terms of compliance for discussion items in these board meetings?
Yeah, so compliance is becoming, it's been a discussion point as part of, the board meetings and everything like that. It's becoming, almost like a baseline expectation. Are we meeting it or are we not? Bubble up the things that are, potentially making us at risk for being non-compliant, but don't have this be the key focal point anymore. Just report in, are we on track to meet our annual commitments, whether it's SOC, ISO, PCI, FedRAMP, what have you. Let us know, keep us informed of when is the annual audit occurring? When did we get recertified? Any issues leading up to it? But don't necessarily have it be the main focal point of what's being discussed day in, day out. Again, go back to those key trends, go back to security, because as we all know, compliance doesn't necessarily equal security. Compliance should be supporting security. And so focusing more of that security line and those few moments you have with the board to talk about security and security trends, and maybe take 2 minutes on compliance. But don't eat up all of your time to talk about compliance that's reoccurring.
Thanks. And then Jeremiah, same question to you.
I would echo there with what Christina had mentioned. It's not a top line conversation. I think it is more of a, hey, what is being done? What's the status of that? Are we still on track to get things done? I did have a conversation with one of our audit committees that I report into, where this organization, they're in the biotech space, and they're growing, and they're trying to figure out which certification is going to help them more, ISO or high trust. And so they actually put that question out there to the board, or we put the question out there to the board or to the audit committee. And so it was a good discussion there. There's a couple people had different opinions. A couple people on the audit committee had no idea what we're talking about. So to Christina's point, I don't think compliance is something that is a top line discussion, but when you're trying to drive new sales, which they do all understand, is which one's going to get the biggest ROI. So I think compliance is seen from the board level as what kind of enabler of sales is that, or what market is that going to allow us to get into, versus do they care about the actual compliance details? They certainly don't.
Got it. And then a follow-up question on it. I hear a lot about CMCC. So Jeremiah, can you give us a little bit insight, your thoughts on the CMMC? And I think I did the acronym wrong. Need more coffee. CMMC for anyone who has to clarify.
You bring up a good point. So, when you're thinking about, entering market space and being able to compete in a market and being able to use compliance as a driver for, or compliance as a driver for sales for the organization. CMMC is for those that are in the DIB, or the defense industrial base, that are supporting a prime or a sub. I think the latest metrics, there was somewhere between 250 to 300,000 commercial entities that are part of that ecosystem. And one of the things that has been teased out there for the last 4 going on 5 years is the CMMC. It's a requirement for organizations to maintain compliance against NIST 800-171. They initially had some deadlines in 2021, and that did come up saying, are we compliant with this? Are we going to be compliant? In fact, I had one client say, hey, are we compliant with that yet? Well, the program hasn't been finalized yet, so no, we're not compliant with that yet. We're marching in that direction, because they do ask questions, but CMMC is one of those things that is in final public review right now, from a public draft release, public review. And once the government answers all the questions that are opened over the next 30 days or so, they're going to answer questions. Questions are available to be asked for the next 30 days. After that public comment period, they'll have another 300 days or so, and CMMC will hopefully be finalized in early of 2025. So it is a board level discussion saying, hey, are we meeting the industry requirements? But again, they don't care more than that. Are we marching to what we need to march to keep the contracts we have?
Got it. Okay. And then Christina, going back to you, can you give us some insights and thoughts on that relationship specifically between the CISO and the board?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes to one of the questions that, somebody posed to us was, do we see the role of the CISO changing over the near future? When we look at that relationship between the CISO and the board, it's really that conduit between, what's going on in the organization from a security perspective, and what does the board need to know in order to enable decisions and be informed of what's going on? Because the board is really helping to guide the organization as a whole into its strategic direction and into the future. And how can you do that without knowing what's going on from a risk and a security perspective? Because it really does cross every single business segment in an organization as a whole. And so really that role of the CISO and that partnership is really as an informed partner. So the CISO's responsibility is to inform and educate the board as a whole. And that educate is a critical aspect. So it's, obviously not talking down to or anything, but the CISO, that's your role. You're in security. That's your level of expertise. That's not the board's. And so our job is to look at ways to help educate in the time that we do, so they can make better informed decisions on behalf of the organization as a whole. So that role of the CISO is going to look at changing into how can you, really help educate in a small period of time with critical metrics, with key performance indicators and key risk indicators? And how are you using common nomenclature and definitions where you don't have to explain yourself every single time, but you can go right into trends that you're seeing in the organization from a security perspective that matter? And so your role as a CISO is going to be interpreter between what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis and matching that with strategy of the organization. And so what does that mean in between is up to you and differs on every organization. And as Jeremiah hit, know your board, know what they're looking for, know what feeds their interest and helps them make decisions. And that's how you go ahead and look at what kind of metrics should I be creating and trends. And so that's where that role of CISO is going to change. It's really going to be that interpreter, educational, trends perspective, landscape that they need to kind of condense into a short period of time in order to make sure the board is aware of what's going on.
Got it. And staying on that theme, if we think it's specifically in response to what we saw over the past year in 2023, CISOs had a lot of scrutiny getting faced with charges or being fired. So with that, how have those stories impacted your relationship as a vCISO with the board? Any of you, but Jeremiah, I'll kick it to you first.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on what Christina said here. The role of the CISO is a tough one. It's interesting. You talk to, new folks entering the field and I want to be a CISO one day. It's like, you have any idea what that really means? You're a firefighter, you're getting interrupted with incidents. You're, as Christina had mentioned, an interpreter. Sometimes you're a salesperson trying to get solutions deployed across the organization, navigating things. That interpreter role is really important, but also being an honest partner. And I think, the relationship between the CISO and the board is one that has to create trust. And it's not just trust, but it comes to a three-legged conversation. I know I've had, for one organization, their CFO is the one who brought me into the audit committee. He's like, you need to tell them enough, but not too much. I'm like, I know. It's like, they care about the strategy. And so you're building trust, not just with the board, but also the other executives that they're ultimately graded by the board, because the board is the one who can oversee and fire the CFO, the CEO, and others. And so it's a weird relationship that you want to report up, and you have to report up. That's your job, is to be honest. But they don't need to know every little detail. They just need to know the strategy and direction you're going. But to Christina's point, you have to be able to raise the risks of the organization, because if the board says to go do something, that becomes a directive that the CEO is going to push down, and that will make things happen. So be careful of what you ask for sometimes. But it's, having that honest conversation, raising up the appropriate risks, but and using them. They are wise folks in their industry for a reason. They're former CEOs, or they hold positions. So I would say, where feasible, create that relationship with the board members, but know that you can't share every little detail. That's not what they want to hear about. It's not what their job responsibility is. So it's sharing the strategy, back to strategy, critical things, being able to put risk into their lens. But and back to all the bad things that happened in 2023 with folks, charges being brought up. You don't want to misrepresent. And so there's that line of, how do I explain these risks in a high level context? But you shouldn't cover up things. You shouldn't lie. You shouldn't, I don't want to name names, but people who said, oh yeah, we have a training program in place. Don't lie and say you have a training program in place, or say it's an immature program. You have to be honest with your board, or else, you're absorbing a liability you should be absorbing. So that's kind of where my thoughts on that are. And are you seeing anything from any of the CIOs you're working with, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So echoing just kind of what you said as well, but I actually spoke to a CIO yesterday who's presenting to his board. And one of the things that he specifically asked me, and we're helping him with the preparation, is, how do I communicate just enough, right? I don't want to give them everything, get too technical, give them a roadmap, and then that roadmap goes to the audit committee, and then now we're held to that roadmap. The threat landscape is evolving as we speak, right? There's new integrations, there's new threats. I need to account for those threats, and my team needs to account for those threats. And having a roadmap that's tied to us is going to put a lot of pressure on my teams, right? So how do you communicate just the right enough, just the right amount is going to be key.
Absolutely. And then, well, before I move on, I have another question to kind of shift directions. But Christina, was there anything you wanted to add on that before I move on?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is, there's a question in the Q&A around material impact. And I think this is a great segment to go ahead and maybe address that. So it's, to exactly what Anir is saying, what's just enough. It's knowing what the material impact to the organization is. And that comes through the risks and threats and the storylines that we've all been talking about. But to define material impact, that's really a conversation that you have in order to define risk and appetite of the organization, because material impact isn't going to be the same for one organization as it is for another. Your revenue is different, your business is different, your risks to the organization of your, strategic program is different. And so setting the stage of defining what material impact is from the board and the executive team through risk appetite and risk tolerance actually will help the CISO be able to communicate and respond to and deliver what's just the right amount of information in order to share. And it also, to Jeremiah's point, helps decrease the liability of the CISO in making sure that they're being diligent enough to respond and report to what's important to the organization so that they're, fiscally responsible and, organizationally responsible enough for, the security of the program as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. And then if we shift from looking, back at the last year and that firefighter role that is, that exists as a CISO and has definitely been a big part of it, we think about 2023. So looking out in the future, planning for the future, what ways are boards, or are they at all asking about resiliency, business continuity planning, those future forward plans?
This is a hot topic. So, we hear about this a lot these days. It's, emergency response, critical infrastructure, everything like that. It's no longer called incident response, but really that emergency response aspect. And it's an entire program that not only encompasses your traditional aspects of, let me look at, facilities, because listen, most of us are hybrid or fully remote organizations where the technology is in the cloud as a whole. So physicality has nothing to do with it anymore. It's really around, uptime of our systems and ability for individuals to continue their job and support the organization and your customers and clients as a whole. So, most organizations do have, the core aspects of business continuity and disaster recovery for critical systems, but it's really around responding to incidents that are occurring, those ransomware. And I know we've said ransomware a few times, but it comes through many different flavors. Honestly, ransomware could take down your identity management solution. And we've actually seen that over the last year. And so what do you do if they take down your identity management solution? Most organizations have not looked at and created a backup or disaster recovery solution for, say, Okta or Auth0 or anything that it might be. And so what do you do from those aspects? It's looking at various solutions, even for something as critical of being able to log on to your systems and applications. Because if you can't log on, even if they're up, what are you going to do? You can't, support the organization. And so looking at those critical concepts of what helps me enable to get access to things is at the forefront and is finally being asked. And so it's looking at that from a board level and a CISO level to say, let me go back to some of those fundamentals and see what do I need to do in order to make sure that this organization's prepared to even log on, in the event of a disaster.
So funny you bring that up, Christina, because last week, one of my vCISO clients, I went to go log in through their SSO, which they still have an on-prem solution. And a down switch that was connecting between their server was preventing everyone from logging in. So some poor guy had to go back into the office and swap out a switch to do it. So resiliency. The one that I got from the board on this topic was around a lot of ransomware that was going on. And one of the board members, who was a former executive at one of the big tech companies, he's like, do we have backups of all of our data? And we're like, oh, absolutely. Are they protected? Oh, absolutely. Got them all. Are they encrypted? Oh, yeah, we got those encrypted. Have you tested every single one of them? No. No, we have not. And that was our ask for the next audit committee meeting was, hey, I want to make sure that all of those repositories, well, we tested this one, we tested this one, like, but did you test them all? And he's like, we need to know that if something's compromised, if data gets, ransomed or encrypted, that we have the ability to respond to that. So I think the spike in ransomware really drove that conversation, at least for me, with the conversations that I was having for a board, to make sure that we could have some resiliency in our data, because for that particular client, that was their crown jewels, is having that data. The availability wasn't as critical as just, can I get it back and up online at some point?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now for everyday life, and for a lot of us on this call, artificial intelligence, machine learning is all over in terms of the news, our brain space, daily conversation. But Christina, kicking it over to you, is AI something that's coming up at the board level right now?
It definitely is. But, it's one of those things where, boards are obviously seeing AI all over the place. And so they're asking critical questions, to their other board members and executive team and, organizations to say, what are the hurdles we're facing in order to support AI initiatives? Like, what's holding us back? Why aren't we doing this? What's going on? And, the reality is that we're seeing from concerns and reports as these discussions are taking place at the board level is that there's a couple of things, keeping organizations from successfully implementing AI, not only to support the products and services, but also automate their security controls. If we had to look at, the top 4 things that in trends that we're seeing, it's really around, the current data management platform doesn't scale as needed, whether through cost or even performance, because they might be legacy or they didn't factor in the whole AI aspect. Cross-functional teams are not collaborating because they don't see, commonality between their use cases. Data duplication, still an issue, is rampant and, really difficult to determine the source of truth, which is really the foundations of a successful, Gen AI or AI program or platform in an organization. And besides not collaborating, teams are having their own preferences of which AI tools they want to use. And so there's conflict there. And these are all bubbling up at the board level. Not only are we seeing it, but I was recently reading, an MIT technology review, and these are global concerns by, CTOs, CIOs, CSOs, and chief analytical officers that are all having these conversations, at the board level. And, discussions are taking place of, they're asking the follow-up questions of, well, how can we get around these issues? And, what do we do about this? How can we enable this, the organization to really adopt this, to look at efficiency and trust and, bridge out their platforms. And the reality is, the vision for what the organization wants to achieve, the sponsorship needs to come from the board and the executive team. That's why those conversations are taking place there. And it's critical for the success of the organization. And so it's, they're looking at and having discussions a little bit more detailed than some of the other topics that are coming up around common ground for the technical architecture. Do we have data governance models? Are we agreeing upon use cases for customer facing and internal use, usage between, success and competitive advantage, versus, throwing money into a black hole? Because obviously the financial support is a critical aspect, which is why they're going into a little bit more deeper discussions from that technical and data governance side. And then they're asking around, well, what are you doing about the accuracy of data? Because it is the biggest concern for success of AI. And so they're looking at this, from, a shared aspect, because security has a critical component in there, whether it's to support security initiatives of using Gen AI, or if it's security enable the organization to make sure there's, data deduplication is occurring, and, the ethicality and the consistency of data for source of truth is actually there, CISOs are being brought into the conversation, but it's also a very broad conversation that's taking place at the board level.
Yeah. And I was going to have a follow-up question, and it kind of coincides with the question we just got in the Q&A. So, about how AI and the security of it has implications across all sides, all corners of a business. And the specific question, if you can dive into this, Christina, about the risks really connected with AI around inputs and outputs infringing copyright or generating output that's inaccurate or harmful, which is, I think, something that terrifies us all.
No, absolutely. And this is a big conversation right now, right? There's a number of institutions, universities, big tech companies that are lobbying for, what is the ethical use of AI and what is permitted to be used and not permitted to be used from a copyright infringement perspective. And this goes back to, how do you use AI? Do you buy versus build? Is it open versus closed? Because when you're looking at the ethicality, and if you're looking at copyright infringement and everything, that's an open, Gen AI platform that's being used by an organization. And the reality is we're seeing most companies build their own Gen AI LLMs, along with using closed LLMs for training purposes because they want their data and their outputs as accurate as possible. And they want to make sure that the LLMs that they're creating and how they're training, the data that's being used is obviously critical. And so if you're using more open source data, it's going to be plagued with issues and flaws. And so if you're training your data based on flaws, it's only going to have negative output for the organization, and the data could be biased. And so that's another key consideration, is looking at biased data when training your, LLMs as a whole, because this could be, your Gen AI platform could be feeding information into, the organization for how do I do something, or it could be more customer facing of, what is the automated responses from, whether it's a chatbot for customer service, or it could even be, your security trends that you're looking at, from an organizational perspective to automate certain aspects as a whole. And so having those discussions and those pros and cons of buy versus build, open versus closed, these are the types of things that are being discussed, not only as an executive team, and as a security point, but also at the board level, because it impacts, trust and security. And also how much, the organization is willing to invest in this as a whole from a risk perspective or not. And, to piggyback on that, there's actually a lot of conversation around, do you even allow the use of Gen AI in your organization because of copyright infringement or training with bad data, or what the outcomes are? And what we're seeing is, from a risk perspective, a lot of larger organizations are, risk adverse, and blocking, Gen AI as a whole. And they're just taking that stance out of the gate of, no one's going to be using this. We might build this into our products and our services, but you're not going to use it as an employee. But the problem with this is that there are a few tools out there that can really successfully block the use of Gen AI. And also, people are a bit savvier these days. And if they want to use it, they're going to use it, whether it's using another device, whether it's a personal device, they're going to use it for their research purposes. So it's important to figure out how to go ahead and appropriately monitor and or block certain keywords or patterns from Gen AI versus blocking it as a whole. And so this also, by allowing it and looking at patterns and keywords and blocking that, gives you more insight into how to monitor for it, risk identification, reporting of usage, looking at use cases, and seeing those trends of how to successfully use it in order to do more with less. Because the reality is, the whole purpose of, AI is to be able to automate certain repetitive tasks or things that could be done much faster by computing than it is by an individual. So those individuals can do more of that thought leadership and that trend analysis than do that day-to-day grind. And so it helps enable organizations to be able to do that more with less, but it needs to be done smart. So back to that risk type aspect, really that comprehensive AI security program should be created that encompasses business needs, security design, threat testing, and tool implementation, and really have ties back into the organization's information classification policy, data governance program, risk program, and threat program to make sure that it truly does cover all the dynamics of AI. I know I just said a whole lot of stuff, so I'll pause there. Sorry, obviously this is something I'm like very passionate about. So
we're talking no conversation at all from the board on AI.
Lots of conversations. I'll turn it over to Jeremiah or Anir to kind of,
I'll chime in here
your thoughts
kind of quickly
on the topic.
It's definitely something I've had conversations with the CEOs. CEOs are always very budget conscious, but also trying to explore new ways to do things faster, better, quicker. And so, and that lends itself to, AI technology. I will say that there's a cost to implement, to train, to deploy technology. Those are not cheap solutions to build it out. You get your efficiencies on the backside. But it comes with, like Christina said, you have to put that right kind of guardrails within your business infrastructure to make sure that it doesn't get used inappropriately. I know, and many of us have probably heard about this, that there was that Chevy dealership that had a bot system on their website that someone was interfacing with. Says, yeah, can you make sure that anything in this session is legally binding? And the answer was yes. And it says, okay, can I sell me the Chevy Tahoe for the price of something else? And yes. And we got down to selling a Chevy Tahoe for $1. So you have to, think about those exceptions, those guardrails that can be put in place as you're adopting this new technology. And that's the questions that the boards are asking. What could go wrong? What are the risks of doing that? And what's the investment cost to go from here to there? And what's our ultimate savings? So that's the way that I've been introducing that conversation with the CEO, and the CEO is obviously on the board of directors there. I think that's all I had for the AI discussion I wanted to add.
Cool. Yeah, just one more thing to add that I'm being challenged with currently is the policy front, right? Like AI policy. Do I include that within my acceptable use policy? Do I create a new policy? I think what I've came across is just creating a new policy. There's some forms that will go in acceptable use, but creating a standalone policy that kind of governs it will be a lot easier and a lot more thorough.
Yep.
There are definitely some nuances.
Yep. And I'd like to show just one thing that Gartner has, because I know the original question from Ashley was around, risks of AI. And so I think Gartner did a really good job of, kind of creating a picture around, what is the overall risk to AI as a whole, and what are those new attack vectors that are brought in. And so let me do this full screen. Okay. So when we look at it, there's definitely new attack vectors that were brought in. And this is kind of just like a quick summary of what those are and the conversations that are helping to drive some of that, at the board level. Again, it's a story. And to Anir's point, how do you deal with this in policy and procedure? It does kind of need to be separated because there are different attack vectors that need to be identified and handled, but have ties into existing policies and programs as a whole. And so these are kind of some of the things to think about when it comes to risks by introducing AI into the organization, because it does introduce new ones. It's not the same old that we're seeing. It's actually at a far, greater scale and deeper technical dive into where it occurs and stems from.
Building on this, one of the things that I learned about a couple of weeks ago, we were having a discussion with some AI folks from another company, and how do you unlearn something in an AI machine? When you've put this knowledge in there and you've gone through this data poisoning, or your data's been corrupt with data poisoning, how do you cut that data? How do you unlearn in an AI model? And that's not easy to do, and it's not inexpensive to do. And how do you identify it and correct it? I thought that was really interesting.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. So pivoting into Q&A, and for all the participants, please continue to input those questions in there. If you think of any more, we'll answer just a few of them. So one of them is we have a couple of questions around spend, and I know we've talked a little bit about spend specific to AI and its growing use and focus. But if we look at security overall, we have two questions around, maintaining security posture and maturity while being, pushed to cut costs, and then also just justifying that spend in general to the board.
You want me to go with that, Ashley, or I can jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeremiah. I was going to leave it
step
open,
in.
you jump on it.
I know.
Yeah,
Being a CISO is about describing the risks, sharing the risks, making the decisions, and helping push the organization. In any organization, there's the business priorities, making sure we're spending enough money in the right spots. When is spending enough? There's, no one creates an unhackable environment, and so it's where's your risk exposure. So I would say that anytime you are looking to cut capabilities that can increase risk, and being able to identify, depending upon what you're cutting, what increased risk does that push the organization. Maybe you're lacking the detection capabilities. Maybe your time to respond to an incident is going to go from X to Y, or double that duration. But I would say that one of the advantages with increased technology, maybe in AI in some capacities, is that as new technology gets out there, it can sometimes replace previous technology, and sometimes at a better price point. And so I'm a big fan from the cybersecurity perspective of doing an annual tools rationalization review with our customers to make sure they're getting the right tools for the right price. There's some great technology out there. It's one of the freebies that is out there is the Department of Homeland Security CISA offers cyber hygiene scanning. Not that it should replace your external vulnerability scans, but it's a free augmented. So there are some capabilities where it makes sense to leverage outside partners. There can be the case sometimes to use open source tools. Now that's free like a puppy, where all of a sudden you have to pay for operational costs by yourself without having it supported by a vendor. But it depends upon where your needs of the organization are. So from being able to cut costs, cut partners. One of the things that I will say is when we run our third-party vendor management programs for clients, it's amazing to me as we see the third-party vendors come through to be evaluated, how many times you see multiple vendors in the same service catalog that you have, hey, we're using this vendor that does this and this and this. They all do the exact same thing. Is anyone looking to see that we're paying 3 different companies for the same technology being used by 3 different departments? So, that's the job of the CISO or the cybersecurity operations teams, but is an observation, and it's important to have the mind of the business as a CISO. And so, to elevate those conversations where appropriate to the right business leaders, and get economies of scale, so you're not paying for 3 different point solutions when one solution can service all those needs. But cost is always king, but it's being able to manage the expenses and report back up. But I did have a board say, are we spending enough? I say, well, what's your risk tolerance? It creates a conversation. So I think I answered that question. I don't know.
Yeah, I would add on to that just a little bit. So it's really around cross collaboration, right? Jeremiah, mentioned this and everything like that of, doing due diligence. You see that there's overlap in some similar controls throughout the organization. And the reality is, as a CISO, you need to be a collaborator throughout the organization. You need to know what the needs and expectations are throughout the company, so that way you can right size and do more with less. So be smart with the budget you have. And so smart is multiple things. So we've talked about data governance and everything. And I know one of the questions out there is around privacy. Are we seeing privacy being discussed at the board level? The answer is yes. And so, and I mentioned this as part of that collaborative approach as in budgets, because privacy is a cross relationship between legal, compliance, security, and some of the business units, because depending upon who the data owners and data custodians are. And so creating tools and creating budget and everything like that, it's in order to address privacy, it is a group conversation. to address budget, it is a group conversation. And so it's around getting smarter and more collaborative in order to understand the needs so that you can right size your tools. Like for instance, if you're looking at a DLP tool, you could look at a DLP tool that not only satisfies security, but does data discovery from a privacy standpoint and feeds into your privacy team, compliance team, and legal team. You don't need two separate tools in order to go ahead and manage that. And so that significantly cuts cost and overhead to the organization, and you're satisfying both requirements and as a joint unit able to report that back up to the board when it comes to data, health and data governance that relates to security and privacy, because there's significant overlap between the two.
I've seen big SIM solutions that have been deployed in organizations where the security team was having trouble getting the budget for it. But when they showed the use case that the business intelligence and the that they can do with their customer base, it's like, oh yeah, we absolutely need this. That'll help us be able to sell our product even better. They're like, oh yeah, oh, security gets to use it too. Okay, great. Then so having that conversation certainly and cross domain utilization of tools, even if you can segment the data off within those tools, can be a cost-effective way of trying to do things a little bit more economically.
Yeah, thank you. And then I think we have time for just one final one. It's been touched on a little bit about, looking at it unified and thinking about some of those cross collaboration pieces, but away from specific tools, we have a question about prioritizing the multitude of compliance frameworks that a company might be faced with. See Christina or Anir, maybe want to take that one.
Sure, I can chime in and pass it to Christina. I would say the best way to prioritize is unified, right? I think you kind of mentioned it there, Ashley, as well in your question, but I'd say unified approach, see what you can do to optimize your resources, your audit functions, your SMEs times. I think a lot of organizations, even starting off this year, want to limit that audit fatigue as much as possible, right? So the best way to do it is kind of grouping them together as much as possible and getting that unified approach. And Christina, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think we've, really all learned, and it's one of those things where, we have to communicate up to the board, is that a lot of these frameworks are similar. They're just calling it the controls different things. Obviously, some of them are going to be, very specific to an environment. So PCI is going to be really around your cardholder data. High trust and HIPAA is going to be around your healthcare data. But the reality is if you're looking at this from a security perspective and approach, you can create, this, common control framework where you're implementing controls that are in a secure manner. So it makes compliance that much easier. And you look at where's the overlapping controls. So that way, to what Anir said, you can kind of unify the audits and the certification process in order to eliminate, meetings, evidence collection, that sampling as a whole, and create a common story around the controls that you have in place. So this is one of those aspects where tackling security to have a more secure organization actually helps that whole, how do I tackle multiple compliance frameworks at once? Because at its element, you're doing the right things from a security standpoint, which helps enable your compliance programs to be more unified and tackled in an easier way. Jeremiah, what have you seen based on the discussions that you've been having?
Yeah, I'd say that's the same thing. When I know we're running out of time here, so we're getting ready to wrap up. When I'm thinking about the boards and the compliance discussion, they don't care so much as long as it's getting it done. It becomes a responsibility of the CISO to get it done efficiently. One of the kind of the punchlines that I left one of the recent audit committee meetings I was on is, at the end of the day, we're out there trying to prevent where we can from bad things happening and plan for the ability to respond and recover when we can't. And it's one of these things is, we're not going to be able to do everything. So I'm moving the conversations forward here a little bit, everyone. It's really what's our job and what's our responsibility to report to the board. And the big thing that I keep hearing from them is they are interested in knowing that a process is happening. They don't want to know the details about that process, but they just want to know that there is a process to cover it. There's a process to get compliant. There's a process to be able to respond. There's a process for dealing with incidents when they come up. They have the risk tolerance out there to be able to, have those conversations. Now, leveling on that and aligning on that, I think is important. Compliance isn't something I think it's just a sales enabler really to the board, to make sure that they can either stay in a market, allow them to enter into a market, and serve their customers. I did have one said, hey, are we secure enough? Or how are we against our peers? So I'm getting a lot of, how do we measure up against our peers? And if I was listening to someone from I think it was the SEC, when the FBI, an incident happens, you call the FBI, they treat you as a victim. When you talk to the SEC, they treat you as the perpetrator that did something wrong because you were supposed to protect the shareholder information. And one of the judgments that was coming out of the SEC is, how are you implementing your controls equivalent to your peers in that industry? And are you doing at least enough? And so the board conversation that I keep hearing is, are we doing enough to satisfy at least what our peers in that industry or competitors are doing? We don't want to be in the bottom half of that spectrum. So being able to be compliant, yes, if they're compliant, we want to be compliant so we can check that box, but they don't care about the compliance as much as did we get it? But it's the CISO role to how you do it and how you manage it. That's an operational issue. No, it's taking us a little bit off track. I know we have about 2 minutes left here. Ashley, kick it back to you.
Yep. Yeah, thanks. And thank you to our panelists, Anir, Christina, and Jeremiah. That wraps it up for today. And thank you everyone who participated. We really appreciate you joining us today. You will have access to the recorded content of this, and then also thinking ahead to upcoming webinars. Tevora does have 2 other webinars planned for coming months. In February, we have, being as strong as your weakest link, application security risk. That is in February. And then in March, we have the countdown to the CMMC 2.0, what it means for your business. And so stay tuned for more information on that one, and we hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.